So
Uh,
welcome to our webinar, an Indigenous strategy in the ESL classroom with Amy Abe, and I would like to welcome her here. We're very happy to have her here. And for those who don't know, Amy is an ESL instructor and curriculum developer with a number of years in the field, and she completed her TESL Masters with the University of Alberta. She did research into interrelationship of instructor knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs towards indigenization of ESL programs. She has participated in development of NorQuest College's Indigenous strategy and is partnering with members of the college to explore indigenization in the language training programs there. So we're really lucky to have you here, Amy. And I won't take any more time at this point. I will turn it over to you.
um, Thanks, Nathan, and thank you, BC TEAL, for having me back. I was at the conference recently, and if you're joining us again, thank you for coming back. I did this presentation in 25 minutes there due to some technological issues. So you can imagine how nervous I was when I was asked to do a webinar. Yay, technology. So if you're back with me today, I'll be giving the full version of the presentation. So thank you for coming. Just to get us started, to give you a little bit of context about where I teach and where I work. I'm in Edmonton, which is on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory. And as part of this treaty, we're beneficiaries to this peace and friendship treaty with the Indigenous nations, the Cree, the Nakota Sioux, the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Métis, and the many others who reside in Edmonton. In terms of the teaching and learning context, I come from a community college, and we're also a regional steward. So we're responsible for not just the Edmonton learning community, but a lot of our rural areas as well. We have a large health, social work, and sort of business focus, but we also provide foundational studies, which includes language training. When I pulled up the stats off the NorQuest webpage at the time, we have about 16,000 learners right now. 60%, as you can see, born outside of Canada. And of that, of our learners, approximately 550 self-identify as Indigenous, but this particular number does not include learners from other countries who identify as Indigenous. I don't think we have those stats yet. In terms of our language training, ESL programming, we have an ESL intensive program and we have a link program. And we use the Canadian language benchmarks as the starting point for our curriculum and our outcomes that we are striving towards. I had 25 minutes at the BC TEAL conference. I have an hour today. There is far too much information to go as deeply or even as broadly as I would like to go today. So feel free to contact me, of course, later if I don't touch on something that you really want to hear more about. I am, more than willing to engage you in conversation. The more people who are rowing this boat, the better, I say. Um, so NorQuest. In terms of our Indigenous strategy, NorQuest realized that we were sort of dropping the ball on our relationships with some of our Indigenous communities and with our Indigenous learners. And I think it was a few years ago, I can't remember the exact year, not long ago, NorQuest recommitted to building a more inclusive learning experience for our Indigenous learners. And so the Indigenous strategy was drafted. It involved all kinds of people, and really, the goal of the strategy was to improve the learning experience and to rebuild the relationships that had been neglected with our community and our Indigenous learners. And the strategy really does talk about balancing Indigenous and Western worldviews and naturalizing Indigenous knowledge as part of reconciliation. And so there's a focus on infrastructural changes, curricular changes, pedagogical changes in order to promote that kind of balance and those better relationships. And in terms of the college, the last time I read the strategy, indigenization is not just for our Indigenous learners, but really is about creating a better, more inclusive learning experience for all of our learners, to create a safe and welcoming learning environment, to promote interculturally competent practice, to balance these different worldviews, and really to contribute to a Canada that includes all of its peoples. And so this is our starting point. My role in this, I was part of some of the conversations that did help draft um, the strategy. But more importantly, I began to wonder what indigenization would look like in an ESL context. For some, there may be an assumption that language programs like ESL or LINK, they don't directly serve Indigenous learners. We don't have any Canadian Indigenous learners in our classrooms. So how could this strategy possibly relate to us? And it does. And so we began a very slow and a very deliberate exploration of what indigenization would mean in a language training program. To reiterate, we do have learners who identify as Indigenous. And so this kind of a strategy and this kind of a process and relationship building can definitely serve them. But more than this, language training really has a lot of opportunity to contribute to this kind of relationship building and to contribute to reconciliation. But we've been moving very slowly, and this is something that we've been praised for, is the slowness in how we're trying to learn and build these relationships, because it's giving us the flexibility to make changes if we make mistakes, to reevaluate, to build the kind of relationships that we need in order to do this right. So where did we begin? Well, we began with an exploratory report, looking for opportunities for language training. Where were the congruences between what indigenization means and what that would look like in a TESL context. So we were looking for congruences between maybe teaching approaches, philosophies, intercultural frameworks, anything that we could use to build from, opportunities for growth and opportunities for change, opportunities for relationship building. And that report resulted in 70 pages of exploration plus 94 recommendations that could be used for administrators, managers, instructors, curriculum developers. And then with my work with the University of Alberta as a graduate student, my capping project research was actually a needs analysis of ESL instructors about what their attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge were around indigenization. A lot of programs, when they develop Indigenous strategies, start building policies, start building those infrastructural changes, that start changing curriculum immediately, start throwing in content, and oftentimes the human element is neglected. And so this is what I wanted to address in my research, and I did. Interviewing ESL instructors, so hopefully we could provide this kind of supports that would be needed in order to empower them to participate in indigenization or decolonization, or what those things could look like in ESL intensive or in LINK in other language training programs. My research actually looked at the interrelationships between all of these things. I won't have the chance to talk about all of them today. As I said, we only have an hour, and I can go for days. But if you're interested in reading about some of these things, I can share the report with you, the research report. The literature review is really thorough, and it talks about a lot of things that are pertinent to instructors and how to support them. So policy developers and managers and program chairs, for example, could probably find quite a bit to help out in there. The literature review is scintillating. I highly recommend it. And so I'll share with you some of the bigger pieces that we learned from this, and then I'll talk about what this could look like in the classroom, because I'm going to assume that many of us here today are teachers and want to have some takeaways that you can start doing right away. So we want to make sure that you see here. So some of the learning. We learned that instructor beliefs are largely established by personal experiences and are not necessarily related to any teacher training programs like BEd programs or even master's programs. And beliefs about good or bad teaching practices are not necessarily affected by professional development. And the odd thing is that when it comes to indigenization, training or professional development that focuses on content or information alone, knowledge-based PD or knowledge-based training, can have some really, really unexpected results. And if you know Canadian pragmatics, unexpected doesn't necessarily mean good. It could mean bad things happen. So for example, a lot of training that focuses only on knowledge, adding more information to the instructor's repertoire of knowledge about teaching practices or history, for example, often results in sort of the opposite of what you would want to happen. A lot of teachers, the research shows, come out of those kinds of PD or training sessions with the desire to be seen as a helper, and they have a great desire to be perceived as different than other Canadians who are presumably more racist than they are, or they are more inclusive than these other people. And the knowledge tends to impact that. These instructors who get more knowledge seem to have a desire to distance themselves from a colonial past or any colonial wrongdoing. And really what we're seeing is that more knowledge, just information-based training, results in a lot less self-reflection in teachers. And less reflection means that teachers have bigger blind spots and can often result in more othering, whether they mean to or not. Less intercultural competence, more ethnocentrism rather than ethno-relativism. And they have a lot of a harder time more difficulty shifting perspective, noticing inequalities. And let me give you an example of what I mean by this. It's an example from the city of Edmonton. We have a lot of summer programs here for kids, for example. I'm sure you do in all cities. And one of the programs had a couple of young women hired out of the University of Alberta who had taken some social justice classes, who had taken a Native Studies class, and really saw themselves as taking the flag. We're going to save the world. We're going to help out. So in this summer program that we're developing here, we want to have an Indigenous element. We want to have some content. We want to include some Indigenous culture. And they went in and we're going to tell you what needs to be here. They were going to develop the curriculum about Indigenous culture to project, to parachute into this summer programming. And really what they were missing is that it's not their culture. They don't. They have a theoretical understanding of this culture, but not a personal understanding. And as my colleague at the college, Roberta Bear, says, she says, "You don't teach about us without us." And so what these young women didn't realize is that in their desire to help, they didn't realize that they were sort of participating in a neocolonialism. They were speaking on behalf of a cultural group that hasn't really yet had the chance to speak much or participate much in the way that they should have been. So this is not what we want in our ESL classrooms. We also know that instructors who have hired, who have developed their intercultural competence may be more effective in noticing othering language or systemic equalities, which is great. And I know that a lot of people in Canada are really looking at developing ICC. When I was in Niagara at the TESL Canada conference, dozens of instructors at all of the intercultural sessions, which is really a great thing. But when it comes to ICC, and I want to say that this doesn't mean that you have to approach indigenization through an intercultural framework, even though you can. It just means that you're better at noticing things that are necessary to indigenize or to decolonize your practice. On the other hand, as an ESL in an ESL classroom, you're already occupying an intercultural space. So there's a bit of a fine balance between being in that, navigating that intercultural space, and maybe incorporating Indigenous teaching approaches or decolonizing your practice. And that's a tricky balance to achieve. And so the more interculturally competent you are, theoretically, the better you are at finding the balance in these things. We also know that ESL instructors can be agents of change, and it's really, we wanted to remind instructors that there is a place for this in your classrooms beyond grammar and vocab. A lot of the research out there is actually advocating for ESL instructors to be participants in indigenization. If you take a look at Korshen, for example, ESL instructors can dismantle systems of equality or oppression, can help learners to participate in multicultural or pluralistic society. The ability to shift perspectives to include minority groups or marginalized perspectives. We can also look at empowering learners. I mean, teaching language is a political act, and what are we teaching them to do with that language? Are we giving them the skills that they need to really build concepts of citizenship to participate in their communities? Are we giving them the language and the critical thinking skills that they need to be active citizens? And the literature does talk about providing dynamic representations of Canada, and not really monolithic, singular representations of culture singular, history singular. So there's some great things out there that really does advocate for instructors as being really in powerful positions to help learners create and rebuild Canadian society in a very positive way. And from the focus group, we did hear that a lot of instructors want to challenge these inequities. They want to be able to challenge stereotypes beyond just saying, please don't say that in my class. Bad, bad. Don't say that. This was one of the comments from one of the participants who said, my students see nations as the low of the low, and they seem to be more hateful than other Canadians. And so what I was hearing from these focus group participants in the needs analysis is that they wanted some sort of tool or some sort of approach that would help them fix their learners, or to be able to challenge the stereotypical views and comments that their learners were bringing to the ESL classroom, which is a great thing. They wanted something. But then we also got comments like this. My learners aren't interested in Indigenous stuff. And this is where I sort of had to pause when I was doing some of my transcribing on this word stuff. Because if we think about indigenization as stuff, or in this case, content alone, really what we're doing is we are looking at indigenization and Indigenous cultures as a thing, as a topic, as historically relevant, perhaps as something to be studied. But when we do that, we're forgetting that indigenization is really about people. It's about humans. And if it's about humans and it's about relationships, then we don't want to forget that it's about the relationships that we have with our peers, or the other students that we have in the college, or it's about the communities that we're living in and the relationship that we have with our neighbors and with our colleagues. And we don't want to forget that indigenization is also about the relationships that we have with shared histories and with treaties. And if we think of indigenization as stuff, then we're also forgetting that it's about a relationship that we have with our land and with the place that we're in. And at the end of the day, if indigenization is stuff, if it's just content and subject matter, then we're also forgetting that it's the relationship that we have between people and how we communicate ideas with those people. So stuff was really problematic for me. And this is where I wanted to talk about indigenization, not as a content piece, not as a subject that we want to study, not as something that we have to add to our already probably overloaded curriculum, or, oh God, it's one more thing that I have to teach. It's one more thing that I have to stuff into my lesson plans, because that's what stuff is. It's just more stuff and we don't have time for it. So what does indigenization look like in a language training classroom like ESL or LINC, or in the EAP class, as the case may be? It could be content, and sure, I mean, content's important. In the context of truth and reconciliation, truth is the histories of the residential schools. It's about the treaties, it's about the Indian Act, but it's also about contemporary issues of relevance to us, such as water security, missing and murdered Indigenous women, idle no more, those things that are in the news. That's stuff, but it's a relevant kind of content. But indigenization is also about teaching and learning processes. There's more than one right way to teach. There's more than one worldview that can inform our teaching philosophies and how we approach learning and our expectations in the classroom. Indigenization is about discovering and creating relationships, as I said, not just with people, but maybe even with the texts that we read, or the language that we have. Understanding perspective and being able to shift perspective. We want teachers and learners to be able to do these things. Indigenization is about fostering critical reading and reflection, and that is a language skill. That's not just a content piece. And developing critical communication skills. The literature calls this decolonizing practice, but I say it's critical. It's indigenizing, and it's going to help our learners look at language in a way that is more empowering for them than just learning the basics. And I'll show you what I mean by that. When it comes to content, I'm gonna say it again. My colleague says never about us without us, and this is where cultures and symbols can be tricky. This is where you want to be careful about including things um, that don't belong to you, or representing cultures and symbols that don't belong uh, to you. There's a chance of misrepresentation. There's a chance of using a symbol that's sacred, or and again, speaking for another cultural group. Is quite tricky. Yeah, there we go. Headdress is perfect example of you know why we might not want to include symbols. The medicine wheel is a great one. It's highly controversial as to whether or not a medicine wheel should be incorporated into teaching by a non-Indigenous instructor. So if we take a look at language, because we're language instructors and I like to start with language, these are some of the CLB outcomes. I pinched them right from the CLB document. I didn't cite them appropriately, sorry. But they're all the way from CLB 4 here up to a CLB 8 or 9, depending on what level you're teaching. And if you take a look at some of the language things that we are working towards if you're in a CLB-based classroom, our outcomes, good question, not sure about dream catchers. It's always better to ask, right? Sorry, if we look at the language outcomes that we're working towards, some of those critical thinking, critical reading, or critical skills are already embedded in the outcomes that we are working towards. So being able to identify mood and attitude is a kind of critical listening or critical reading skill. To be able to identify reader-writer relationship, to evaluate ideas, to compare and evaluate information, for example, to draw inferences about implied meanings, to infer biases, assumptions, positions, and motives. All of these things are critical reading and listening skills, and they are in there, right there in the outcomes. And so in this case, we're not necessarily looking at adding content, but exploiting these outcomes that we already have in a way that promotes indigenization in the practice. So at NorQuest, we recognize as that not every teacher, depending on what their intercultural competency is or their experiences, has the confidence yet or the ability yet to read or listen critically in the way that we would want our learners to. We're not born with critical thinking skills. We're not, they're practiced and they're developed. And so we wanted to create a tool that would help learners develop these skills, really to facilitate that noticing process. And I'm going to show you a bit of this tool in a second, but really, the tool or the guide can be applied to audio material or text material prior to a lesson to help the instructor notice things about that text. We're not going to be able to always create new content, and textbook publishers aren't out there right now furiously writing new textbooks to align with truth and reconciliation. So you got to work with what you have. So the tool helps instructors make those critical reading noticing things, such as noticing who is included or excluded, dominant minority perspectives, biases, or stereotypes. And in so doing, they can identify new opportunities for learning. We've also had instructors at NorQuest actually use the tool with their learners. They actually gave parts of the guide to their learners as a critical reading or a critical reading exercise. And so learners, for example, had the chance to notice whose perspectives were included. If you're not sure, how can you find out? There's checklists that the learners can use, and you can, of course, adapt the language choices to suit the needs of your learners. So if I can give you a couple of examples of what the learners noticed when they used this tool, it was really quite fascinating. Now, I'll give you a very, very obvious example. We went to a chapter in a textbook that actually talked about Indigenous languages. I won't tell you which one, but this is what the learners noticed about this particular textbook just by using that noticing guide. So in this particular chapter, Indigenous languages were described as dying out or endangered, or the cultures were described as disappearing, which the learners felt was actually sort of this very neutral way of for it was almost a passive, natural thing that was happening to these different Indigenous peoples, rather than there being an agent of disappearance or an agent of endangerment. And so noticing these language choices really fostered some critical understandings of why these language choices were being used. Non-Indigenous peoples shared opinions about Indigenous language and whether or not these languages should be saved. So the Indigenous perspective was missing. All the writers were non-Indigenous, and when the learners Googled them, they turned out to be white European writers. And they claimed that Indigenous peoples were, and I quote, choosing not to assimilate or were responsible for the dying out of their own cultures. The learners were eventually in the tasks asked to role play or to write from the perspective of corporations or from governments, where they had to argue whether or not governments or corporations should respect Indigenous perspectives. There was quite a dichotomy between civilized and savage, modern and primitive comparisons going on. And my favorite was when learners were asked to write questions about Indigenous culture, singular, monolithic, and then answer the questions themselves. So you can see that the tool here, or the guide, I don't even know what you want to call it, but it really opened up a far more critical and interesting exploration of language within the context of that textbook. And learners were they were digging in there and understanding language in my opinion, a far more interesting way than just by following the standard. And what if we hadn't opened these conversations? I don't know what impact that might have had on a learner who noticed these things but wasn't given the chance to talk about them. I don't know. Other things that learners have noticed, if you take a look not just at vocabulary, as the learners were really doing here, you can even notice grammar, for example. I didn't cite this very well either, but this was from an article on the 60s Scoop. And if you take a look at the passive voice here, Native children were removed from their homes and placed in. And then we have this word dislocation being used. And so the learners were talking about how passive voice was really removing accountability from those who were doing the removing. And it's a very soft term, removal. And there was no agent of removal. And then, these other really gentle terms that were being used to describe what was actually for many a very violent act, a very traumatic act. What I found interesting was, and the learners found interesting too, is in the very same article, the author seemed to shift language. It was kind of interesting. I'll show you. It went from this passive, neutral, kind of gentle language and suddenly got really harsh. The federal government had wronged thousands of Aboriginal citizens who were ripped from their families under the relocation measure, separated. They were effectively abducted from their homes and shipped off to somewhere where authorities considered a place. So it was the learners noticed the shift in language and wondered why it had gone from this really passive, agentless, I take no responsibility for this kind of language to a very harsh and critical thing. And they were able to look at the difference between the vocabulary choices that this author had used in the different sections of the article. So even the grammar that's being used, that's a language thing. We can teach passive voice, for example, versus active voice. But we can empower the learners to understand why those grammars are often used, or why those vocabulary choices or euphemisms are being used in place of stronger words like abducted, shipped off, versus dislocation, relocation, removed. They were placed in the care of these very loving non-Aboriginal families. Sure. So just to show you, these are things that the learners did. This is not the students, or sorry, the teachers. On the other hand, teachers can notice these things in advance, and they can plan for this before they go into their lessons. Now, just to let you know, the tool doesn't focus only on Indigenous peoples, but really you can notice other minority perspectives that are included or not included and how they're represented. The Chinese students in my class, for example, didn't particularly like the term alternative medicine being used to describe traditional Chinese medicine. They identified it as a bit of an othering term. Alternative to what, teacher? Well, what do you think? Well, mainstream normal Western medicine. And so they talked to, they unpacked that term alternative. So it doesn't have to just be for Indigenous learners, but really you can start digging into other marginalized groups or silenced groups, which the learners tend to appreciate. They feel like they're reading more deeply than they used to. So to move on to sort of the teaching processes now, out of just curriculum, what I've got here in this really beautiful fuzzy little diagram is a very, very general description of what an Indigenous teaching and learning approach might look like. This might not be true of all Indigenous cultures across Canada, but my colleagues and my Indigenous, the elders at the college, for example, have said that this is generally reflective of what it could look like. Which many have noted perhaps that this Indigenous approach kind of resembles an inquiry-based approach, which many might be familiar with, which, if put into a language context, if you're familiar with a task-based teaching and learning approach, kind of resembles the task cycle. So let me put this into a little bit of more of a linear Western paradigm for you, a table. If you take a look at the Indigenous cycle of teaching and learning and compare it against the task cycle, there's quite a bit of congruence in terms of what the teacher is doing and what the learner is doing and what the intent of each stage in the cycle is. The biggest difference in the Indigenous cycle, which I actually quite like, is that the learning, the task, in our case, the language task, should have some sort of authentic connection to the community. Something, whatever it is the learners are doing with language, should be more than just as real as possible within the confines of our classroom walls, but rather should actually extend somehow and contribute to the communities that they're actually living in. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we've extended task cycles into an actual very real community context, and what the impact of that was on the learners and the community itself. Some of the things we've done within our classrooms is we've looked at talking circles. I know that many people are familiar with talking circles as an Indigenous approach to learning. We've extended that and adapted that into reading circles and listening circles. And if you're interested in how we approach those, we have some materials that we can share with you as well. So that the talking circles really do take on a new life within a language learning context, very learner-centered. And very, very rooted in community, if you want it to be. We've also done reflective journaling with learners, especially when we're doing intercultural work. But the reflective piece on language learning is really quite integral to working with an Indigenous approach. We've put more focus on visual representation, mind mapping, for example. Storytelling we've integrated, and there's some really great materials or resources out there that help ESL instructors specifically on integrating storytelling. There's some really powerful research out there about the benefits of storytelling in ESL. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but when it comes to community engagement, this is the piece that might be a little bit new or seem like it's a bit more work. But at the end of the day, the work is actually going to be worth it. So in my classroom, for example, when I started thinking about how I was teaching and how I was teaching learners to use language, I wanted to have more of a community involvement. So for example, I've brought my learners to the GRANDIN LRT station, and I've got a great story about that for you in a moment. We've engaged with the City Arts Council and the Rogers Place Arena. Some of my students have actually started volunteering more in the college and more in the communities as a result of the work that we've been doing. My learners, my classes, some of my colleagues' learners as well, they've been involved in Indigenous ceremony within the college. And what's really cool is that because of some of the relationships that we've been building with the elders or other Indigenous students in the college, etc., we've actually been invited to ceremony now too. It's not just us knocking on the door saying, hey, can we come and talk? Can we come in and hang or whatever? So some students have been at smudges, for example. Some of our teachers have been at pipe ceremonies. It's been really cool. Some of my learners have actually gotten to know their neighbors who are Indigenous, and I've got a really great story for that. We've engaged in human libraries. We're building relationships with elders, and we have an event called Inclusion Fusion, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a second here. We have a human. I wish I could see you guys. I don't know if you're familiar with a human library or not, but this was a terrifying experience for my learners who were really in the beginning quite terrified and frightened or apprehensive, I guess, of engaging with people who were different. And because of some of the ways that we approach differences, unpacking those feelings within a classroom, the human library engagement became a really powerful experience for many of my learners. Lower benchmark. Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that towards the end. Yes. Learners were asked to engage with the storytelling with those human library participants, looking for stories that resonated with them, stories that said resilience, about overcoming obstacles, for example. And I'll share the testimony of one of my students who was involved in a lot of the community-based work, the inclusion fusion work. She says, I am a Muslim woman, and people assume that I am against homosexuals. I'm against this, I'm against that, but it's not true. I like to think that I have an open mind, but I realize I need an open mind. Sorry, I realize that I need a growing mind, not just open. Saying, your experience doesn't matter to me, like, you're gay, but that doesn't matter to me, means that I'm not listening to you, and I have no chance to know your experience. Like, I've lived next door to my neighbor for years, and I didn't know her. And now, after the Inclusion Fusion event, after some of our Indigenous work, now I feel empowered to talk to her. I started with hello. She's an Aboriginal woman. She's very elderly, and we meet and we talk all the time now. She tells me about her time in the residential schools, and I'm helping her to write her story. Sometimes I cry, and sometimes I get so angry, but most of all, I know that I want to make a difference in how Canadians understand each other. So the impact on some of the work that we've been doing has been really cool. She cries every time she tells this story. She's a real softie. Another one of my students actually said that after we started engaging more in the community and we started digging into the language that empowers or disenfranchises, he actually said he started to feel more responsible for his community. And he actually started volunteering, which I thought was a really cool thing. And he talked about his ability to shift his perspective and how he's not the same community and how his community actually felt different to him. He felt closer to his community. So that was a really cool thing. There's more, but time flies. But I want to share with you the GRANDIN LRT station. The second day of class this semester, I dropped my students off at the GRANDIN LRT station, and I said, see you later. I said, please sit here. I want you to be here for about 20-30 minutes, and I just want you to look and notice and take notes about what you see. And when we come back, we're going to start some conversations. So in the GRANDIN LRT station here in Edmonton, on one of the walls is a very large, substantial mural. You can see a couple of pictures of this. Yeah. Oh, yes, Dawn. I will definitely touch on this towards the end. I've got a really great story for you. You can see here on the wall of the LRT station that there is a mural, and I don't know if you can see, but here there's a picture of a religious man. This is Archbishop Vital Grandin. There's a nun here holding an Aboriginal child, and I don't know if you can see what's behind her. Can you guess what this one is? This is a residential school. And the entire mural that's on this particular wall is really in celebration of Archbishop Vital Grandin of the neighborhood, and depicts the history of the neighborhood from their perspective, from a very celebratory perspective of Vital Grandin and his residential schools and his relationship with the Indigenous peoples of the area. Now, this was done in the 80s, and this was done by a non-Indigenous artist called Sylvie Nadeau. And of course, this stirred up some conversation because many people were upset by the representation of the history in the station. And so this is where Aaron Paquette, a local Métis artist, was brought in to be a part of this conversation. And he did not recommend taking down the mural. He said it has to stay. But what needs to happen in order for reconciliation to be true reconciliation, is that we'll add to this. We'll have, he calls it a conversation. And so this is where Aaron Paquette's artwork was added in response to Nadeau's artwork on the opposing wall, the Indigenous perspective. And now we have, you can see here, this is the installation, the Indigenous perspective on the relationship of the Indigenous peoples of the area to the neighborhood, to the land, to the history. A lot of the imagery also talks about the potential future of relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the area. And what's really fantastic is that Sylvia Nadeau was brought back in to be part of this process. So the Indigenous child that she painted here in the arms of the nun was painted again. She added this piece here, it's a drum, and she's got the Indigenous child painted as an adult now who is celebrating his culture, his language, his dance, and there's quite a number of Indigenous symbols around it now. And so now we have the two representations bridged, and it's really opened up quite a bit of dialogue. So what this experience initiated for my learners was a whole process and inquiry into public art at Edmonton. What are the advantages of public art? Why didn't the Indigenous community have a voice in this project in the first place? And this is where they've started engaging now, well, in the Edmonton City Art grant application process. Because of their new reading skills, their ability to notice these things, they've noticed inequities and problems living within the grant application process. It's a systemic problem. It's a systemic barrier. For example, if you want to apply for public art grants in Edmonton, you have to have a degree, which is a huge barrier for immigrant artists or Indigenous artists who may not have formal post-secondary art education. So they're automatically excluded from being able to participate and have a voice in the culture of Edmonton. And so my learners, the more they learned, the more that they wanted to do something about it, and they've ended up writing reports about the benefits of public art. But in the report, they've also identified these systemic barriers and have made recommendations about how to be more inclusive. And they're getting ready to send these reports to their MPs, the MLAs, to Aaron Paquette himself, and to the mayor of Edmonton. I'll let you know how it goes. But those reports are just being finalized now, and that's what I mean when I say the learners are completing a task, but it's extending out into a way that's very authentic, and it is going out into the community, and they're excited because they're hoping to get a response from one of the people that they engage with. Within our community as well, we've started building relationships. This is Kyron. He's one of our Aboriginal student mentors. He's a fantastic young guy. He's a storyteller. My learners really respect him. The storytelling has been such a cool thing. This is Elder Tony. He's been in some of our classrooms. He talks and connects with students. But in terms of teacher empowerment, and this is where I want to put some focus, it's not just about what you do for the learners. When we look at Indigenization, it's also going to be about what you do for yourselves. And so we talked about teachers needing to have a more reflective practice. And so in order to do that, we started engaging in some teaching triangles where now we can see ourselves through a different lens. We can see ourselves through the lens of our colleagues and get more feedback on whether or not our practices are aligning with what we would want them to do. I say I want to accomplish things in my classrooms, but maybe I've got a blind spot. And so maybe my colleagues can help me identify what those blind spots are, or we can talk about our teaching practices. And some of the ways we can reflect on our practices is when we do any manner of self-reflection. Is you can ask yourself, what is your worldview? Like, do you have you established it? Have you considered it? And have you thought about how your worldview is shaped? And worldview could mean what you believe about teaching and learning. How does this affect the way that you teach and learn? What do you believe about teaching and learning? And to what extent do your teaching practices align with what you say you believe? So if I believe this thing and I say this, is that what I'm actually doing in the classroom, or is there a blind spot up? And can somebody help me reflect on that? So we've started engaging in a lot more reflective practices, but asking ourselves some harder questions other than did I meet my outcomes, or how was my time management? We can go a little bit deeper than that to make sure that we say we're doing what we say we're doing, we're actually doing in the classrooms. So the self-reflection in terms of teacher, I guess, part of teacher evaluation, teacher processes is really important. And really, at the end of the day, the more reflective we are with ourselves, and the more we promote that critical noticing with our learners, and the more we empower them with noticing skills and those language skills and those perspective shifting skills, really what we're doing is we're creating a community of problem solvers. We're creating, people who are building different ideas of what Canada can be and what community can be, and how they want to participate in how they want to participate. It's really quite a big thing. And I have no relationship to this publisher, but this is probably one of the most profoundly affecting books that I have read. Don't be fooled. I know that the title says Solutions Economy, and it does have this interesting economy undercurrent to it, but it really does provide a neat way of looking at problem solving and critical understanding and reconciliation, and solution building and community engagement. My learners are also reading pieces of this particular book and are finding it so engaging. So at the end of the day, what am I saying? Indigenization really should be a heck of a lot more than just including history or symbols. We really want to look at processes and how we're engaging with language, how we are engaging with content, and the kinds of relationships and teaching practices we bring into the classroom, and consider, are we helping our learners? Are we helping truth and reconciliation, if that's what our goal is to do? And are we helping ourselves be a part of the solution versus just leaving the blinders on and continuing as normal? I'll leave you with this. This is one last story. Somebody was asking about low-level learners and learners who could identify with language loss. This is from one of my lower level learners who had a really hard time engaging in class. He was a refugee, didn't participate a lot until we started doing some of this critical engagement with the community, some work with the human library. And he came in one day after he had read a story from that had been shared by one of our NorQuest students. The student was an Indigenous man who had danced in the Vancouver Olympics in the opening ceremony, wearing his full regalia, the headdress, and his beautiful regalia. And my learner came back in and he was crying, in a good way though, and he sat down in one of our talking circles that we have. And by the way, I've got great lesson plans for talking circles. And he said, well, which story resonated me? He said, the story I read, the story about this guy, he danced at the Olympics. I didn't know about his culture and how Canada tried to genocide his language and culture until recently. His story resonates with me because he went to dance at the Olympics in his cultural dress and cultural dance, and everybody there was happy. And it reminds me of my culture in my back home, how they try to genocide my language and my culture. And I see this guy at the Olympics and he dancing his dance and he does his culture and speaking in his language, and I am hope. I am hopeful about my people. He shows me he is resilient and that I can be resilient too. So it's never 100% for everybody, but from a language perspective and from a community engagement perspective, small steps, sloth-like slow steps in the right direction can have major impact in ways that maybe are unexpected. So that's it for me yammering on. I think I've left a glorious 9 minutes to address any questions that you might have.
Wow.
Hi!
Yeah, that was amazing. I'm sure I speak for a lot of people that was it's surprising to me how much you have done with your students, and the steps that have been made. It's just been absolutely inspiring and incredible. So thank you for sharing that, Amy. That was quite moving at times. So thank you. We
Oh,
have some
sorry,
questions?
Cloudy over here. I completely agree. Do not, I highly recommend reading the actual report, at least some of the victim impact statements, if not the calls to action. Good question. I teach everything all the way up from CLB 4 to 9. Some of those learners are literacy learners, just depending on the year. So, sorry, Nathan, I'll let you handle the questions.
No, good. I know. You're the one answering them. You do that. Absolutely. You got it. That's perfect. I do know that Patricia had asked a question about lesson plans and stuff like that. And I don't know what there are for resources like that that could be used in class.
The fun thing is, and by fun I mean not fun, is that there seems, in terms of ESL, I know that there's bucket loads of work being done with heritage language teaching and learning, which I think is glorious. But a lot of, when I was starting my research with the U of A, I started this a year in advance of when I knew I was actually going to be doing my capping project, because I was fusing two completely different fields, ESL, TESL, and social justice and these things. There's nothing, or there's nothing available that if there are ESL instructors doing this work or creating resources, we are living in silos, which I find very frustrating. And when I was at the TESL Canada conference, it was actually the first time I'd had the chance I'd had to meet a person who was doing work in the area that I was doing, and I'm like, "Hey, man, give me your card." Like, we need to talk. We need to share what we have. We and not just with each other. So I am confident that there are people who are trying to do this. One of my colleagues here at NorQuest, I know for sure, is doing this, but we don't get the chance to really talk about what we're doing, and I think that's a colossal mistake, because indigenization is about, and decolonization, which is a strong word, but it's about these relationships and the sharing of ideas. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel in every single classroom that we're in, and we don't want to be doing it alone. So yeah, see, there's people, they're in silos, though,
Well,
literal or figurative, I don't know.
and this is something I'd like to kind of collect. Like, we're going to collect some of these pieces that were shared. I know some people shared some links, and then of course you had shared the book, the Dialogues Project, and
I can share the
sorry,
noticing tool as well. The noticing tool has been very popular. The tool is a terrible name, but we're calling it that anyways.
Right.
I've been since, and I can email that to you. Not a problem. Or
Because then what
not
we'll
you.
do is we'll collect all of those things, and we'll put them together on the blog post along with the video here, so that there's something to link from. And I know there's some things that are in my head that I can take back to the BC TEAL board, and we see what we can do to extend this conversation and make this further. I know that there's a lot here to unpack, a lot.
Yeah, Saskatchewan is doing, that's the thing. Like individuals and provinces are doing some really cool work. Saskatchewan is miles ahead of Alberta, so is BC. And which was part of my it's how I got mired here, because I wanted things that were relevant to Treaty 6 and were relevant to Alberta, and not a lot being developed yet. So I did actually pinch from Saskatchewan and BC when I was doing some of my research pieces. So thank you to those provinces. You guys are awesome.
And I know there's a lot out there, so we just need to get this and start compiling it, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe this is the start of that conversation. I really think it's. I know for myself, I was quite moved by it. So yeah.
Oh, colonizing, yeah. Well, this is the fun part. If you approach indigenization through decolonizing methodologies, or I hate the word methodology, approaches, really what you're doing is you're helping them dismantle systems that are colonial in nature, or Eurocentric in nature, and that way, it's not just deconstructing systems of oppression. I'm getting all technical here, but systems of oppression that exist for our Indigenous learners, but really helping immigrants identify where those barriers and blocks are that are built into our government. For example, the City Arts Council application process. They were like, wait a minute, so and I have learners who are very sensitive to colonization, because they come from countries that are still, they're colonial. They have been colonized, and so they're very interested in talking about these things. So anyway.
Are there any other questions out there? I know a lot of things going through your head, like me, I'm sure. But we can always, I can always forward these off to Amy later as well too. I think Fiona's asking something
low
about the low
levels.
levels.
It can be done. It can be done. You just you want to start out with language appropriate, obviously level appropriate. So do I have a slide here that I can give you an example of? That one where I was talking about what the learners noticed from their textbook about Indigenous languages actually appears in a textbook that's appropriate for an intermediate level, but a very similar chapter appears in a textbook for like a beginner level as well. And so even just asking really basic questions about, who wrote this, what is their background, which is a CLB4, what is the perspective of the writer kind of thing, can be done at a very low level, or helping students understand the loadedness between certain vocabulary choices can be really important. I like to talk about the word normal in this context. It's not necessarily an Indigenous context, but what does normal mean, and how is it being, when you use it, what are you suggesting about what's not normal? A crippled, for example, versus a person with disabilities. So these things are they're loaded, when we look at language choices. So it doesn't always have to be with an Indigenous context. It can be. Yeah, looking at Canadian symbols is tricky too. There are a lot of people who talk about the Inukshuk being appropriated for the Vancouver Olympics. The Canadian government decided which symbols were okay and which magically represent Canada, and which are not okay and are oppressed under the Indian Act. And so, yes, yes. Emily, with the LGBTQ2 community, absolutely. I've done this in we had a really great speaker, Massey Whiteknife, come in, who identifies as Métis and Two-Spirited, and my learners, celebrations, or like Canada's birthday versus the anniversary of Confederation, really basic things that you can really look at as the. So sorry, back to the LGBTQ2. We used the tool with the speaker, and learners were able to engage the conversation they had with Massey Whiteknife from a much more inclusive place than they might have if we hadn't done those conversations beforehand, the unpacking beforehand. Going back to Canada 150, opportune moments, celebration, birthday versus anniversary. Canada was discovered, or Europeans encountered these people or discovered these people. They're very, very basic things you can do with lower levels. So I know that some of my colleagues are working on it. Yeah, picture books, so good. The noticing tool has a guide for deconstructing the pictures that are used in those books, and what is it like, how is that person being represented, or whatever, that symbol, right? So kind of fun.
All right. Well, we've hit kind of the end of our time. We could just keep going. Keep going and going. But we'll probably wrap it up here. We do want to say a hearty thank you to Amy.
Thanks for having me back. It was cool. And
really,
thanks for bearing
really
with
good.
me. I'm way more stumbly when I'm nervous, so I appreciate not.
I felt it was quite natural. I felt it was quite well done, and I really appreciate that. And I know a lot of other people do as well. And so thank you very much, Amy. And
Thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate BC TEAL. You guys rock. So
thank you very much.
oh, Jennifer P.